In February 1945, at the end of World War II, the Soviet Union carried out one of the most elegant and successful intelligence operations of the 20th century. It began not with spies in the shadows or covert agents climbing embassy walls, but with a perfectly crafted diplomatic gift. During a visit to Moscow, the young pioneer organization of the Soviet Union presented U.S. Ambassador Averell Harriman with a large wooden plaque of the Great Seal of the United States. The gift seemed symbolic and harmless, a gesture of friendship as the Allies celebrated victory over Nazi Germany. Harriman, unaware of any hidden purpose, proudly hung the plaque in the ambassador's residential office inside Spaso House. For 7 years, the United States had no idea that the gift was actively listening. The device inside the plaque was unlike anything Western intelligence had seen. It contained no power source, no wires, and no traditional electronics. In fact, nothing inside looked like a microphone at all. It was a masterpiece created by Soviet inventor Lev Theremin, the same man who designed the world's first electronic musical instrument. Theramin's creation was a passive resonant cavity, a device later called the Thing. It worked only when a radio beam was directed at it from outside the building. Once activated, the thin membrane inside the cavity vibrated from sound waves in the ambassador's office, modulating the reflected signal. This gave the KGB a live audio feed without emitting any detectable signal of its own. For years, Soviet operators sitting in a nearby building routinely aimed a narrow radio beam at the embassy residence, capturing conversations of senior U.S. diplomats, meetings, private discussions, and strategic planning during the early Cold War. The Americans discovered nothing. Regular sweeps found no active transmitters. Engineers were confused. Nothing seemed suspicious. The breakthrough came only in September 1952, during a routine security check. A British technician happened to scan the room at the exact moment the Soviets activated their radio beam. A sudden spike appeared on his receiver. He repeated the scan. The spike appeared again, only when the beam was active. What followed was a full dismantling of the Great Seal plaque. Inside, U.S. intelligence finally uncovered the small, elegant cavity device that had silently listened for 7 years. When the story reached Washington, it caused immediate alarm. CIA engineers were stunned by the level of sophistication. NSA analysts called it decades ahead of Western technology. The revelation became public in 1960, when the United States used the device as a visual demonstration during a UN meeting, proof that Soviet intelligence had infiltrated American diplomatic spaces long before tensions escalated in the Cold War. Journalists dubbed it the bug with no battery, and intelligence agencies worldwide began studying passive devices in detail. This operation, simple in appearance but revolutionary in execution, set the stage for everything that would come in the decades that followed. Hidden transmitters in embassy walls, secret construction infiltrations, and some of the most advanced surveillance methods ever used. The Thing was the beginning of a long, silent war fought with radio waves, engineering genius, and devices no one knew existed. How the United States discovered that the Soviet Union had wired an entire building before it was even finished. When the United States decided to build a new embassy in Moscow in the 1970s, the Cold War was in full force. Washington believed that by using American materials, American engineers, and strict security procedures, the building would be safe from Soviet surveillance. It was a dangerous assumption. From the beginning, the project faced unusual restrictions. Soviet construction crews insisted on handling major structural work, claiming that only they understood local regulations and climate requirements. American officials protested, but the U.S. State Department eventually agreed, partly to avoid political tension, partly because they underestimated what the KGB was capable of. By the early 1980s, the building looked ordinary from the outside. Inside, however, it was something no one had seen before. A massive integrated listening device disguised as architecture. When U.S. technical teams began installing communication systems, they noticed small irregularities, metal reinforcements that were not on the blueprints, extra cavities in support columns, unusual concrete layering. But nothing suggested active electronics. Routine sweeps found no signals. The building was considered safe. Everything changed in 1985. A new technical inspection used more advanced resonance detection equipment, capable of mapping hidden conductive structures inside walls. What they found stunned everyone involved. Entire sections of the embassy, columns, floors, beams, contained embedded antenna-like elements. They weren't microphones in the traditional sense. Instead, they were passive components designed to work together as a distributed listening network. when activated from outside with a specific radio frequency. These elements could capture audio vibrations from inside rooms and relay modulated reflections back to KGB receivers. In other words, the embassy itself was the listening device. U.S. counterintelligence immediately launched a full-scale investigation. Engineers began cutting open structural elements. In every other concrete column, they found more components: metal plates, resonance cavities, conductive loops, and other parts placed during construction. Long before Americans entered the building, some were placed so deep inside the structure that removing them risked destabilizing the entire floor. The conclusion was unavoidable. The KGB had infiltrated the project at the blueprint level and built surveillance into the skeleton of the building. The discovery sparked outrage in Washington. The U.S. called it the most sophisticated penetration of an American diplomatic facility in history. NSA analysts privately admitted they never imagined a foreign intelligence service would undertake such an operation due to the complexity and cost. The political consequences were immediate. Construction was halted. Entire floors were declared unusable. The building became a diplomatic embarrassment, and congressional hearings questioned how the United States could allow such a breach. In 1987, Secretary of State George Shultz announced that the top floors of the embassy would be completely demolished and rebuilt, using materials flown directly from the United States. A new team of American engineers was sent to Moscow, and Soviet workers were heavily restricted from the site. The KGB operation delayed the opening of the embassy for years. It cost the United States hundreds of millions of dollars and delivered one of the most humiliating counterintelligence failures of the Cold War. More importantly, it proved something that American agencies had underestimated for decades. The Soviet Union did not simply build listening devices. It built environments designed for listening. The Moscow embassy disaster became a turning point in U.S. security protocols, changing how America approached construction, inspection, and foreign deployment for decades to come. By the early 1980s, the CIA believed it had finally adapted to Soviet surveillance tactics. Regular inspections, advanced sweeps, and controlled equipment shipments were supposed to guarantee security inside U.S. diplomatic missions. But in 1983, the National Security Agency received intelligence that hinted at something unusual. Encrypted communications from the U.S. Embassy in Moscow might be compromised. The warning was vague. No devices had been detected. No transmissions had been intercepted. Still, something felt wrong. For months, the CIA and NSA couldn't identify the source. The Soviets had not penetrated radio channels, nor had they managed to access secure rooms. The truth was far more unexpected. In early 1984, NSA analysts proposed a bold theory. What if the KGB had modified the embassy's office equipment before it even arrived in Moscow? The idea sounded implausible. Every device used in the embassy's secure areas was manufactured in the United States, tested in the United States, and shipped in sealed containers. But the more analysts reviewed anomalies in communication logs, the more they suspected that sensitive material might be leaving the embassy through a physical source, not through electronic transmissions. The breakthrough came in January 1984, when the NSA recommended removing every typewriter from the Moscow embassy and transporting them secretly to the United States for a full forensic teardown. The operation was classified under the name Operation Gunman. When the first typewriter was disassembled at Fort Meade, engineers immediately understood the scale of the breach. Inside the casing, in a space where no component should exist, they found a small, precisely machined metal bar with embedded sensors. It wasn't just a microphone. It was a keystroke logging device, entirely passive, activated only by a narrow radio beam from outside the embassy. Each inscription on the page produced a unique mechanical signature, which the passive sensor reflected back to KGB receivers. This meant that every classified document typed on certain embassy typewriters had likely been intercepted. The shock grew deeper as more machines were examined. Out of 16 IBM Selectric typewriters used for sensitive communication, 8 had been compromised. Each modified device contained handcrafted parts so sophisticated that NSA analysts estimated hundreds of hours of machining per unit. The components were undetectable by standard embassy sweeps. They emitted no heat, no power, and no radio signals on their own. What stunned investigators even more was how the devices were installed. The modified typewriters were not intercepted during shipping. They had been compromised before the United States ever took possession of them. Evidence suggested that the KGB had gained access to the manufacturing process through covert contacts with foreign suppliers. In other words, the Soviets tampered with equipment at the source, long before it reached American hands. This revelation forced the CIA and NSA to reconsider everything they thought they knew about KGB operational capability. For years, U.S. diplomats had typed confidential reports, lists of personnel, coded messages, and internal assessments on machines that silently transmitted their secrets to Soviet intelligence. By mid-1984, the full scope of the breach had become undeniable. The U.S. State Department launched a massive equipment purge. Every typewriter, copier, telex, and communication device in the Moscow and Leningrad consulates was replaced. Dozens of new procedures were created for diplomatic equipment security. For NSA, Operation Gunman became a textbook example of how sophisticated, patient, and methodical the KGB could be. Years later, former CIA counterintelligence Chief James Olson summed up the operation with a sentence that reflected the gravity of the event. "They weren't listening to our words. They were reading them." Operation Gunman remains one of the most remarkable and underestimated examples of Soviet technical espionage, proof that the KGB didn't need walls or wires to break into American secrets. Sometimes all they needed was a typewriter. In the early 1950s, the CIA believed it had found a perfect way to penetrate Soviet communications in East Berlin. The idea was ambitious, risky, and unprecedented. Build a secret tunnel under the border and tap into the main landline cables used by the Soviet Army. If it worked, the United States would gain access to raw military and intelligence traffic flowing directly from Moscow to Soviet headquarters in Germany. In 1954, the CIA, working with Britain's MI6, began the construction. Only a handful of American officials knew of the plan. The project was given a code name, Operation Gold. Engineers worked from an underground facility disguised as a warehouse in West Berlin. Using advanced boring equipment, they built a tunnel 450 meters long, running deep under the Soviet-controlled sector. By 1955, the tunnel reached its target, a cable junction used by Soviet command units. Technicians carefully installed tapping equipment, coils, amplifiers, and recording systems capable of capturing low-frequency landline transmissions. When the system was activated, it worked far better than expected. Every day, thousands of lines of military conversations and logistical reports flowed into CIA listening posts. To Washington, it was a triumph. To London, it was a major intelligence victory. But there was a problem no one knew about. Inside MI6, one of Britain's highest-ranking officers, George Blake, was secretly working for the KGB. He had already betrayed numerous Western operations to Moscow, but Operation Gold was one of the most valuable secrets he delivered. Blake informed Soviet intelligence about the tunnel while it was still being planned, long before construction began. The KGB now faced a dilemma. If they shut down or rerouted the cables immediately, the West would realize there was a mole. Instead, the Soviets chose a more subtle strategy. They allowed the tunnel to operate for nearly a year, feeding the CIA real but carefully filtered communications. Sensitive or strategic messages were diverted to secure lines. Less critical traffic was left in place, creating an illusion of genuine interception. By early 1956, the CIA believed the operation was a complete success. Thousands of tapes had been recorded. Analysts were working around the clock, examining everything from troop movements to logistics patterns. In reality, some of the most critical Soviet communications had never touched the tapped cables. On April 24, 1956, the Soviets staged their final move. Under the cover of routine maintenance, Soviet engineers accidentally discovered the tunnel. Soviet media quickly turned the event into a propaganda spectacle. Reporters photographed the equipment, the cables, and the tunnel entrance. Moscow accused the West of espionage on a criminal scale, while the CIA was forced to shut the operation down and extract its personnel. For the KGB, the exposure served multiple purposes. It embarrassed the West, protected Blake's identity, and allowed Soviet leadership to publicly condemn American spying without revealing the true extent of their own counterintelligence penetration. The CIA, unaware of Blake's betrayal, initially believed the discovery was just bad luck. It wasn't until 1961, when Blake was finally exposed as a Soviet mole, that the full truth became clear. For years, analysts wondered whether Operation Gold had been worth the cost. The tunnel, equipment, and logistics were extremely expensive, and much of the intelligence collected had been pre-filtered. But later studies showed that at least some of the intercepted communications, especially routine military chatter, provided valuable insight into Soviet organizational patterns and procedures. Still, Operation Gold entered history not as a triumph, but as a lesson. In espionage, even the most technically brilliant operation can collapse if the enemy knows about it from the beginning. The Berlin Tunnel remains one of the most audacious and controversial intelligence projects of the Cold War, an operation that succeeded, failed, and misled the CIA all at the same time. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the KGB had perfected surveillance on a scale that seemed almost unimaginable. It was no longer limited to embedding bugs in furniture or embassy walls. Entire cities, particularly Moscow, had become living listening networks. Every street, every office, every building of importance could be monitored with astonishing precision. The backbone of this network was the passive and active acoustic surveillance system, known internally as the Central Technical Department Project. It combined several layers of technology: wiretaps, radio frequency devices, and passive resonant bugs like the legendary thing that had shocked the US decades earlier. But now the Soviets were scaling the concept, making the city itself part of the intelligence-gathering apparatus. One of the most striking examples involved the US Embassy and diplomatic residences in Moscow. Over time, engineers discovered that the KGB had embedded listening devices into structural elements. During the construction or renovation of buildings, even in areas considered private, like ambassadorial apartments, these devices were carefully shielded from standard sweeps and, in many cases, had no active power source. They could only be activated remotely using specific frequencies, rendering them essentially invisible. But the reach of the KGB extended far beyond physical structures. Couriers, diplomats, and even ordinary visitors could inadvertently become part of the system. Microphones disguised as everyday objects, lamps, clocks, ceiling panels, were everywhere. Mailrooms were compromised. Telephone lines, even those thought to be secure, were routinely tapped. In some cases, the Soviets installed surveillance systems directly inside Western companies' offices operating in Moscow. The US response was gradual and cautious. By the 1980s, after multiple discoveries of embedded devices in walls, ceilings, and office equipment, counterintelligence teams began deploying advanced electronic sweeps, using frequency analyzers, infrared detection, and even vibration sensing. Every inspection revealed how meticulously the KGB had planned their operations. The scale of the network was staggering. It wasn't just about capturing diplomatic secrets. It was about creating an entire environment that fed intelligence to Moscow, without the targets realizing it existed. Analysts later described it as a living, breathing spy system, an urban surveillance operation that combined human intelligence, technical ingenuity, and patient engineering. These operations were not cheap or easy. The Soviets invested millions of rubles, coordinated thousands of personnel, and spent decades perfecting techniques that would make modern cyber espionage appear primitive in comparison. Yet the results were undeniable. By the mid-1980s, the United States knew that every conversation, every classified discussion, every strategic plan within the embassy walls could have been intercepted at some point. The revelations shocked US intelligence agencies. They sparked a transformation in counterintelligence. Protocols, stricter inspections, better construction oversight, and comprehensive training for diplomats to recognize even the most subtle signs of surveillance. The idea that an entire city could become a listening post was almost impossible for many Western operatives to comprehend. Even decades later, historians and former intelligence officers describe these operations with a mix of awe and unease. The KGB had turned Moscow itself into a silent observer, demonstrating that espionage was not merely about individual spies, but about engineering environments to gather information continuously and invisibly. For the United States, these lessons reshaped the Cold War. They revealed the sophistication, patience, and audacity of Soviet intelligence and reminded the world that in the game of espionage, ingenuity often mattered more than brute force. The story of the KGB's listening network remains one of the most extraordinary chapters in modern intelligence history, a reminder that the line between safety and exposure can be hidden in the very walls around us.